which is like concerns and challenges that we are still facing as a country. The particular slide that you see is from the Asian Ministerial Conference that was held in 2016 in India and was inaugurated by the Prime Minister of India. And we had hosted a side event for school children. The theme was centered around disaster risk reduction. And the particular poster that you see is the first prize that was won by a young ninth standard student from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, who had perhaps, as families and as a island place, they had witnessed the tsunami in 2004 in India. From the Indian context, if I may start, we'll just brush through how the generic scene here is, and then we'll move to floods and the two concerned areas, that is health and food nutrition. So in Indian context, we did not have a very integrated or a very mainstreamed approach for disaster management for a very, very long time. Although we did hugely suffer from droughts and famines earlier. We did have issues of floods, but they were considered less of disasters, and as compared to droughts in India, and we used to have decades of famine, so there used to be huge losses to crops and to human, the social fabric also. But we did not have yet a proper policy for disaster management. Our attitude and approach in India was more that it is something, it's a wrath of God, and it is something that the God is angry on people for doing certain activities, and that's how we used to perceive disasters for a very long time. Heavily, the relief or the support system approaches were dependent upon government aids. So we were relying more on government interventions, government support systems, rather than empowering people, or rather than encouraging communities to become more self-sufficient, to become more aware. We were still, communities were dependent on government to provide support. Okay, that if some disaster occurs, it would be the government that needs to worry and that needs to take care. And because for us in India, the concern was majorly drought. The subject was at that time dwelt by the Ministry of Agriculture. Very less dependency on civil support other than army. Army was heavily relied upon to cater to managing disaster scenarios. And then came certain years quickly, one after the other, that in India we witnessed a lot of mega disasters, and there were definitely many more smaller incidences occurring across the country. But there were some very major events which kind of caught the attention of not just people in general, but also the governments, the state governments and the center. So there was an earthquake that occurred in a place in Maharashtra in India, which was otherwise not known to be earthquake prone. And that is why, although we are going to speak more on floods, we always encourage people to take up earthquake as integral to all their planning approaches, to all their preparedness approaches, because you still have a challenge in terms of earthquake early warnings. And secondly, earthquakes are known to occur in places where perhaps those places are relatively, less prone to earthquakes. Then there was another coastal state in the east coast of India that witnessed a very severe cyclone. And then there was another major earthquake in the west coast in the state of Gujarat in 2001 that saw huge losses in terms of collapses to the health system, to the healthcare system. One of the major hospitals in one of the districts that was severely impacted by the earthquake had fallen down, and it was very difficult for the local administration and government system to take care for so many people, right? Because the capacity on which they were relying upon, that major hospital, it had collapsed. And this can also be related to the current pandemic times, when the entire healthcare system across a lot of countries had gone very overwhelming in terms of the capacities the hospitals had to cater to large number of COVID-19 patients, right? So that this pandemic has been one major another event that has been witnessed by a lot of countries. And then what India witnessed along with some more coastal states or countries was the tsunami of 2004, which was a kind of a eye opening for the country, that a lot of our efforts are perhaps not streamlined. We still have a lot of gaps. We are not doing a proper hazard risk assessments. We still lack good early warning systems for India. We did not have good building laws, building codes. We did not have safe building guidelines in India. In terms of awareness and sensitization, communities across India were still very much ignorant. Environmental degradation was another concern that was, taking or gathering a lot of attention, because there is a parallel debate going on about how development it kind of increases the vulnerabilities, or parallelly how development can also be seen as an opportunity, as a window for promoting better mitigation and preparedness aspects in terms of disaster management. So there was a lot of environmental degradation being experienced in a lot of developmental projects. They were catering or triggering new disasters. Our search and rescue was not technically up to the mark. We were still relying on a lot of primitive ways of rescuing people, whether it was floods, whether it was earthquakes or landslides, which the Indian Himalayan and hilly terrains was very prone to. And we still, despite the best of efforts in terms of relief provisions, we were in an inadequate capacities. So that triggered for India what was the paradigm shift that we in a lot of times we talk about, the need to move from a relief centric approach to a more holistic approach, where we talk about not just managing a particular disaster situation, but trying to come to a situation where you minimize the impact or reduce the risk of that disaster from happening, which is something that you and we nowadays talk about, the term disaster risk reduction, the DRR approach that we all are discussing these days. So because India has had the history of such, this is how the genesis or the thought of putting into place, putting into action a disaster management act came into picture. And 1 year after India experienced tsunami in 2004, that the Disaster Management Act of 2005 came into existence, which also kind of, had an institutionalized way of looking at disaster management subject. It made roles and responsibilities more defined, more standard procedures to be followed, not just by the government at the center, which is the central ministry in India, where you have the federal system that you call, and then you have the respective different states in India, which are made mandatory with certain responsibilities. So in India, if you look at the Disaster Management Act and what it says, it is generally the responsibility of the particular state which experiences a particular disaster or an approaching, the fear of an approaching hazard. So it is state subject, and that is why in India, you see that in different states, the priorities are different. Some states are very proactive when it comes to working on flood management, flood risk management, or landslide risk management. And there are some states which are lacking in some of their efforts for community awareness, or for dealing with some of the hazards that those states are prone to, because it is a state subject and the center directly does not intervene, right? Now for India, this is how the structure is. This is just to give you an overview, just a backdrop, and then we'll slowly move to floods and related issues. So we have a Niti Aayog, a sort of a planning commission that decides upon the budgetary provisions to be provided for states. I will also show you one slide of the current latest budgetary provisions, how the breakup is in India for different activities in disaster management. We have the establishment of the National Disaster Management Act, and likewise, each state in India has a state disaster management act. And further, like in a lot of places, you call the counties the small districts that you have. Each state that comprises of different districts. So each district also has smaller district disaster management authorities, which generally formulate the guidelines to be followed in respect to the disaster management activities, and also with respect to the developmental activities that are to be taken in that place. Okay, this is just an overview. The act also makes it very mandatory that the country needs to have a national disaster management plan, which India already has. You can also download a copy of the National Disaster Management Plan of India that was first formulated in the year 2016, and it was upgraded and updated in 2019 from the NDMA website. Once I finish the session, I will share the website with you. And likewise, in India, it is mandatory that each school as a sector and each hospital as a hospital sector, healthcare sector, needs to have their emergency disaster management plans in places. It's a huge country. We have, in terms of schools, colleges, in terms of healthcare provisions, there are vast systems present. So it's still, we are still on that road where we are moving towards having these plans in places across these sectors. Now, for India, and even by and large, if you otherwise look at the statistics globally, it is generally that it is the hydrometeorological hazards and disasters that impact people and societies more. So if you compare it to other geological events like landslides, earthquakes, or biological events like endemics and epidemics and the current maybe pandemic, as compared to these two events, it is the hydrometeorological events, which means the water and climate related disasters or hazards and the subsequent disasters that are more in numbers, which means countries across world experience heavy rainfalls, have issues of floods, have issues of cyclonic activities and wind disturbances, heavy wind speeds, tornadoes, hailstorms, issues of cloudburst, especially in the hilly regions, issues of cold wave seasons and heat wave spells, dry spells, which are increasing. They are also related to how the El Nino and La Nina affects temperatures across globe. You also experience and witness, and of late in India, in the last 2-3 years, there have been heavy incidences of snow avalanches, which are snow landslides, if I may call in simple terms. Then you have severe drought situations, which are also attributed to because of less rainfalls. India is still an agrarian community. We largely heavily rely upon rainfall for our agriculture systems. So we experience heavy droughts as well. India has almost 7,500 kilometers long east and west coastline, where erosions in different patterns, it's happening, it's not uniform. So there are some coastal places in the east and west coast which are experiencing different levels of erosions, and which means the sea levels are rising, temperature is warming. So a country like Maldives is going to is under tremendous fear of drowning, because if it's an island nation, and that's a concern for some of our coastal places also, where you will be losing a lot of your landmass, right, to erosion. Then in India, we also have concerns of water and climate, which is related to weather changes, which is thunder and lightning. We are experiencing a lot of deaths of migrant laborers, of farm laborers who are losing their lives because of thunders and lightning affecting them, and also tsunami. So even otherwise, like I mentioned, you have the water and weather related events which are increasing, which means in terms of reducing their impacts, in terms of being better risk informed, in terms of reducing the chances of these events converting into disasters. We need to focus more on water and weather related events. If you look at this statistics for India, this is with respect to 5 major natural hazards, and then when they convert into disaster. For us, one of our major concern is definitely drought, which affects our crops and agriculture products. In India, we have almost 12% of our area which is prone to floodings. But if I have to show you another picture, it is the 12% is only limited to actually the riverine floodings. So what you see in the yellow portions across the Indian map is the rivers and the river floodings that occurs. But if you actually include a lot of other kind of floodings, which is urban flooding, which we also understand it as artificial flooding, which is because how we are constructing, how we are doing new constructions, the kind of land use patterns, the kind of the land is being used for different activities. There are choking incidences of drainage concerns, which causes flooding like situations even because of less amount of rainfalls. Then the statistics, this number would actually change. So this 12% for India is only referring to when there is heavy rainfall and when the rivers get flooded. So the neighboring places, the neighboring areas get inundated. So these are all the yellow portions that you see is areas which are prone to floodings because of rivers. All right. Now, a food for thought for all of us, and there must be similar concerns. This is a picture from one of the cyclonic activities of May 2020, which hit the coastal state of West Bengal for India. So here. And this was also the time when globally we were all worried because we were all suddenly impacted by a new term, which was the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic that struck a lot of countries. So we were having the challenges of the states suffering from heavy wind speeds leading to heavy rainfalls and a flood-like situations. And then you had a lot of people housed in the camps, in the relief camps, where there were concerns of their basic health issues, basic sanitation provisions, basic hygiene concerns, basic food nutrition concerns, and then the protocols which were mandatory of social distancing and norms which were to be followed. How daunting and difficult it becomes for local administration, for governments to actually take care of or deal with such situations. And I'm sure participants from different countries will also relate to this situation because these are concerns for other countries as well. So, the point I'm trying to make from these two slides is that you will have flooding like situations, you will have parallelly a lot of other events happening, which means it is always imperative, it is extremely necessary that in your plans, you need to always look at a multi-hazard scenario. You definitely can address some of the major regular concerns as isolated single events, but by and these concerns, which will also impact a lot of your resources, natural resources. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, no, because somebody
Ma'am,
from the participant.
in between we lost you
Oh,
in the
okay,
last
it's
slide. We
clear.
lost you. Yes.
Did I miss
So in
out
the
on any point, or the flow is fine?
yeah, it will be like good if you can like share one more time the last
Yeah,
slide, ma'am.
so
What
I
what
was
you
referring to the importance of in planning a multi-hazard approach, definitely I was saying that you should be taking care of single major events which happen in isolation. But whenever you look at larger agenda of disaster risk reduction, your approaches should be more on a multi-hazard approach. That is what I was referring to. And then the in additional concerns that are being posed by the changes or fluctuations in the weather scenarios, in the climate variabilities and fragilities that is posing. So what globally we all would be experiencing is, we in general terms we always use that there is going to be a rise in temperatures, there's going to be a rise in temperatures, but how this rise in temperature is going to impact hazards and the subsequent disasters that will happen is the concern. So which means if there is going to be changes in your temperatures, it would mean that there is going to be an increase in erratic rainfalls, which is something not common across, at least in India, which is now on a rise. And erratic rainfalls would also mean it would not be uniform in places, but it would be more intense. And if it is going to be more intense, you will have to link it to how urbanization is occurring. So if you are having more developmental projects around it, it would mean that erratic and intense rainfall would lead to small or bigger flooding situation. So the number of flooding seasons or durations would be on a rise. So that's also going to happen. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am. Now it's fine. No,
Huh.
no issue.
Okay. That is part one. And parallelly, uh, extremely on the other end, you will also have these changes in temperatures. It would also mean you would have longer heat spells, which means the dry seasons, the dry spells would increase, durations would increase. So that will have impacts not just on health, which is one, that is related to ailments, related to skin conditions, skin ailments, other related ailments, but it would also mean that you will have more droughts, or you will have less amount of water for irrigation facilities. You will have a stress on water as a resource. So again, water will become a major concern here, right? So these are things which are being as per the the interpanel, that climate change IPCC reports and all, which we look at the latest reports of IPCC and all, they are making these projections and claims. So you, in your planning, you can go with a lot of these presumptions for the next 20-30 years. So your infrastructure building, your developmental agendas also should be designed around these presumption factors. This would also mean you will have more number of natural calamities, in terms of, which means natural hazards converting into disasters. It would also mean directly, indirectly putting more stress on human life and other life forms also, because it would definitely enter your biodiversities and ecosystems, right? It would also have more transboundary concerns. So which would mean interstate concerns or inter-country concerns, like India, Nepal, always has concerns with respect to whenever there's rainfalls in the upper regions, and then how it leads to flooding in Bihar and all, right? So likewise, there'll be a lot of inter-transboundary concerns would also increase. You will have quick, more maybe perhaps melting of glacier ice portions, which would mean there would be more outbreak, right? Of which the term that we use, GLOF, glacier lake outburst, that would be on a rise. Now that in itself cannot be an isolated event. So if you're going to see more glacier outburst, it would mean it would lead to maybe related landslide events, or like how it happened in the state of Uttarakhand, hilly state of Uttarakhand in India in 2013, that the trigger was a glacier outburst, and then that led to, because it was also a rainy season, that led to few landslides, that led to because of the developmental activities, you were putting all the silt in the rivers, so the carrying capacity of the river was reduced, so it led to flooding in that river, and it eventually led to a lot of destruction around that river zone in some of the places in that district, in that hilly state. So, which means again, you will have concerns around your river systems, your river functioning, and it would also mean that it would increase chances of inundation and flooding scenarios. Similarly, if you are going to experience these weather changes, there would be a sea level rise, which would also mean one of the major, another social concern that we also see around floodings and droughts is the migration issue. So, which means there will be a lot of out migration and also reverse migration concerns, and which would add to the number of refugees in different places, because if your coastal belts are going to be flooded, then definitely people would need refuge, which would mean in terms of a human development agenda will also get impacted, right? And likewise, I was mentioning how the coastal erosion is going to impact the coastlines, so that is going to shrink your coastlines, so that will also have impacts. And definitely one sector that will severely be impacted is the agriculture sector. Likewise, you will also have issues around biodiverse zones. There will be issues about how mutations would happen, mixed breeding of different endemic species would take place, and this would change the ecosystems. This would bring a lot of changes. These are changes which perhaps are secondary, not quickly visible. It would slowly be inbuilt, and that's even a more major concern, because that is not something which is very clearly visible and you can easily take care of. So that will have long-term repercussions. That is something I'm just trying to harp upon. Now, over the years, you had the international decade between 1990 to 99 declared for natural disaster reduction. You had the Yokohama conference around the subject of disaster management, leading to countries signing the Hyogo Framework Treaty, which meant we would be trying and managing our situations more. From there on, countries have now moved to the Sendai Framework. Again, this is a place in Japan. This Hyogo also was a place in Japan where these treaties have been signed, or these documents have been signed. Now we are trying to harp upon the disaster risk reduction concept. So we are saying, let's not focus and emphasize more on management, but let's emphasize more on prevention. Let's emphasize more on mitigation, and to be in a state of readiness. So that's what is the DRR. You also need to integrate them with the sustainable development goals. I'll be focusing on two of the major sustainable SDGs for today's presentation. You cannot look at human development indicators and parameters in isolation, because there are a lot of disasters that impact the achievement of these sustainable goals as well, right? Now, these are some of these goals. Now, if you are trying to have quality education, but you had the pandemics, and for 2 long years you had to completely revisit the education system. You had to completely reorient the education system. You had to move from a class to class, face-to-face programs to a complete online mode. It was challenging for a country like India, where you still have very secluded zones, where people do not have smartphones, where people have issues of internet access. So online education mode becomes difficult. So in one place, if you're trying to achieve quality education as a human development goal, but then there are disasters which are pushing you back in that agenda. And that's the reason why I'm harping that you need to look at them intricately. So these need to be interwoven. So whenever you are trying to make some projects, design some projects and plans around disaster risk reduction, you also need to design and integrate it with some of the sustainable development goals. Okay. Two of the goals are prominent for today's, or are concerned in today's presentation, is goal number 2, SDG number 2, that talks about trying to end hunger, trying to achieve some amount of food and nutritional security, trying to improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture, right? Now, if you're looking at floods as an event, now flooding, which for India you have so many states where you experience intense flooding seasons, and people are marooned, secluded. They live on embankments for months together. The entire support machinery, the entire management machinery becomes so overwhelmed that it becomes challenging to even feed people, right? To even provide the bare minimum to people during these times. And here, at the same time, we are talking about increasing and enhancing the nutritional capacities for people. If you look at how pandemics impacted, in India, this is a statistic specifically for India. In India, every third child is under the age of 5 is malnourished, which means this SDG is such a big concern. Now you add to this the issues of floodings. You add to this 2-3 months of the times when you're pushed back uh, in your development because of severe floodings or severe cyclonic activities. How this is going to be a major health impact also. Underweight children, the percentage is very high. You have children who are stunted, so their growth is not up to the mark which is like for a 5-year-old child should have. So they are under, in terms of their growth, they are stunted. Wasted is a category where the children are very lean. The young children, the young kids are very lean. They do not have that adequate amount of weight that they should have in that age group. Now these are things which are attributed to because of maybe you can relate it to how droughts impact, how floodings would then add to this concern, which already otherwise is a concern in terms of development, right? Likewise, for India, definitely, we do talk about safety nets. The government machineries talk about public distribution systems. We have a very good scheme in India, which is called Integrated Child Development Services, where we have provisions at the very local village level, where people, where we have what in India we call Anganwadi workers. In India, we call them. These are sort of support systems. They are these are people who help provide midday meal schemes for children, or inform families about the importance of nutritional values, and also help in facilitating nutritional food items. Now these are small schemes which India has started. We also have some amount of standard operating procedures to be followed during emergencies, during floods, or during cyclones. Yet, I would say, in terms of trying to achieve nutritional value, in terms of trying to achieve a better food provision values, we are still in the field of disaster risk reduction. We are lacking behind. It's still a challenge to integrate this requirement so that children are not malnourished. There is good amount of food which is a mixed blend of the right amount of nutrition which is required. Now that's one. And the second agenda was from the health perspective, right? So you have healthcare system, you have an apt in India, we have an apt healthcare system, we have apt facilities, yet the pandemic saw our capacities becoming vulnerable. We saw the deaths of huge number of doctors and paramedic support systems losing their lives, succumbing to this pandemic, because they were constantly in touch with, constantly, they had that exposure of patients around them. Initially, there was a less, the personal protective equipments were very less. That support was very less, and that perhaps led to more exposure. So the pandemic as a big disaster has pushed back even the healthcare system, right? So after a while, slowly we picked up during the second wave, and the frontline workers, in terms of the people that you look up to as capacities, the point is that they are also vulnerable. So you need to adequately take care of them also. Now, otherwise, that's just around pandemics. But even in general, if you are looking at sustainable goal number 3, which talks about ensuring healthy lives for every individual in a country, or trying to promote well-being across all age groups, there is still a huge challenge. All right. We still need to scale up our investments in healthcare coverage. There is lack of healthcare insurances, similar policies. There are issues of healthcare around healthcare workers. There's still, the pandemic has halted the progress or reversed the progress in terms of life expectancy. There are ample statistics from various disasters, especially floods, cyclones, and earthquakes in India, which show that some of our vulnerable groups lose their lives most, especially females, young children, they lose their lives more. There are premature delivery rates very high post during flooding seasons, and also during intense cyclones, or some when they're under severe traumas. So there's a huge setback even in terms of the healthcare provisions. We in the pandemics are trying to promote wash hygiene. You need to constantly wash your hands. You need to have soap. You need to have sanitizer provisions. But I'm sure a lot of participants would agree with me and also relate that water as a very basic amenity and necessity is still a challenge for a lot of places. So, and at the same time, it becomes a very basic essential to survive during the pandemics. So imagine the challenge it poses, and secondly, the amount of stress it poses on water as a resource, right? Now, parallelly, when you're talking about well-being, it also needs to assess or also need to address the mental well-being. That's another very important concern. So the physical well-being, and also how psychologically people are impacted, how psychologically it enhances the stress on people, whether do they are in a position to have some positive coping mechanisms, whether they are in a position to adjust to those flooding situations or not, that becomes a concern. So these are two areas, two human development parameters, areas that need to be blended when you're talking or trying to manage maybe floods or related events. Now we can also try and look at some of the solutions from what we all these days use the term as nature-based solutions. It's something very simple. So it's basically just one umbrella term that you use to cover a lot of different ecosystem-based approaches. So you talk about ecosystem-based approaches, you talk about ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, you talk about green infrastructure, trying to have more forest areas, trying to grow more forest, trying to grow more mangrove patches across coastal areas, so that people are saved from flood waters, from storm surges, from tsunamis. So trying to basically draw a lot of your solutions from nature. And at the same time, you also need to talk about, you blend it with restoring some of these wastelands, or some of these wetlands, or some of these ecosystem solutions which are you are losing. At the same time, trying to manage them, trying to protect them, conserve them, and parallelly in a barter, trying to use some of these to the benefits of human well-being. That's the whole idea when you talk about nature-based solutions. So around floods, around cyclones, around droughts, you can weave some of these solutions at maybe localized levels. Some of these solutions can be very local examples. Just to quickly present to you, in the current latest context in India, the budgetary provisions that India is providing is under the heading of the National Disaster Risk Management Funds. And for each state in India, you have state disaster funds. This I just wanted to show how the budgetary allocations are divided. So in India, for the response activities and for relief, 40% of these budgetary provisions can be utilized. This is the amount for the current financial year. Out of this total amount, you can utilize for long-term reconstruction and recovery 30%. For a more proactive approaches, from the purpose of minimizing the impacts of disasters, for reducing the impacts of disasters, for managing hazards, 20% funds can be utilized for mitigation purposes, whether you want to go in for structural mitigation or you want to go in for soft non-structural measures. Like I had also mentioned about, the green infrastructure approach. If you are talking about future projections of increased heat wave spells, so that means for urban areas, that is going to be a major challenge. So you need green sheds, you need more green zones, you need to have your infrastructure built around the provisions for soothing impacts, right? So that's how you have to link the climate fragilities, the concerns of increased rainfalls, erratic rainfalls, the likelihoods of increasing floods with some of these nature-based solutions, and also the kind of funding provisions. So you can utilize some of these funds, and also you also have almost earlier we used to only have 5%, but now realizing the importance of capacity building for communities, raising awareness, the funding has been increased. I'll take you through some 2, 3, 4 examples of how local level people are dealing with floods in India. That's just a way of sustaining their daily livelihoods, sustaining their how building or adapting to a particular situation. And that is also when if you easily bounce back, that is also something when you say that it's the resilience building, right? So we are also trying to promote the concept of resilience building, which also you can understand it as trying to just adapt to a particular situation. So if you understand that you have rivers which perpetually flood, you may not have a lot of local examples otherwise available. You may have some standalone solutions, but not replicable. Maybe in terms of financial feasibility, they may not be in a replicable provisions available for you. And then you need to deal with those flooding situations. And that's what, when you say that you adapt to that particular kind of living, right? So there are just few examples I'll be quoting further, for which we also encourage everyone. We also kind of, through our trainings and capacity building initiatives, talk about at the community levels or at the grassroots level, if you will understand the term more, understanding and identifying or making an inventory of your particular hazards, how the different sectors in your area would get impacted because of those impending or already present hazards, and if your area is prone to a particular or multi-disaster situations. So for globally, it is also estimated that by 2050, nearly about 40% people would be now, they would start habiting, they would be living around the river basins, which means two things. A, your riverine floodings are going to impact them more. Inundations would impact their living livelihoods and also their infrastructures and also their livestock. And secondly, there's going to be more stress on the requirement of water as a resource, especially for Africa and Asia. Now, that's a big challenge. We are already struggling with some of the challenges and concerns of people in the coastlines. In India, because that was one of our major concerns, you had the establishment of the coastal zone regulations. Time to time, they keep changing and updating and modifying those notifications for India. And now they have made it a better blend in terms of even disaster management component being integrated. So now what you have in the Indian coastal states is called the integrated coastal zone management approach. So those coastlines are divided into 4 zones in India based on the kind of habitations that you see. And in the similar manner, because a lot of Indian states are prone to flooding, and with this kind of statistical evidence that you have, India has also come up with the river regulation zones. So now we are also going to streamline some of the activities, the permissible and prohibited activities to be carried around the river zones. So that is a way in which legally, as per the Act and also as per the mandates of the Disaster Management Act, we are trying to work, right? Needless to say, and not to forget, you have different kind of vulnerable sections and vulnerable groups. in your zones. So depending upon the kind of vulnerabilities socially, that's the social fabric, that's the most important fabric that you have. So you need to address and ensure that there is an inclusive approach in all your activities. You need to make mainstream their concerns and address their concerns. That's just for that understanding. At the community level, if you involve the local people, their understanding, their local coping mechanisms are they generally have better results as compared to experts from outside who would be presenting some ideas. So it's always nice and it's always advised, and we do advocate this at all times at the grassroots levels, to involve local community people in some of their plans that you design for their benefits. All right. Now, this is one very beautiful example that was started originally in India, in Gujarat, in the state of Gujarat, in the west. It's a state in the western part, where some of the marooned places, some of the marooned zones, during or in the pre-monsoon seasons, they used to store granaries. They know that sometimes it takes time for help to reach to them. So the community themselves, because again, not to forget, you have different vulnerable groups. Small children cannot stay hungry for a long time. Feeding mothers, lactating mothers, pregnant women, they cannot stay hungry for a lot of times. So these communities, they used to store granaries until external help used to reach to them. So that's the community initiative. And this is how they used to deal with long durations of, this is spread widely across a lot of other states where you have flooding as a perpetual concern. Definitely in the pre-monsoon seasons, when you know that for the next 2, 3, 4 months, you might have to vacate your homes, evacuate, move to safe zones, move to higher elevation grounds, move to embankments, you should definitely encourage your community people to make small kits, emergency kits, with some dry ration, maybe some biscuits, maybe some chocolates, maybe some dry fruits, whatever is actually feasible for that community people. Some local dry food items which will sustain during monsoon seasons and which would also give you energy. Have first aid kits. Don't forget, you as a family know the composition of your family. You may have family members who are prone to some comorbid, they are asthmatic, they have some diabetes, they need some special medications, and that is something known to only you as a family. So you should always ensure that in your first aid kit, based on the kind of family composition you have, some emergency or those specific medicines should also be a component. Sanitary pads, shaving kits, some important documents, a little bit of cash is always handy. It comes really of good use. So likewise, you can form a small drinking water, be it any kind of a situation, and especially floodings. Post floodings, it is the water system that gets impacted. It is, I'll show you another example. So it is very important that you always make a provision of little bit of drinking water. This is an example from the state of Assam, which is one of our northeastern states. And, they took up a beautiful way of building capacities of school children around minor treatments, around small life and life safety tips, around how traditional early warning messages for floods, because some of these areas in Assam are very prone to floodings. So perpetual they had these issues. So they train these children. So one, across schools they have taken this scheme. They have their project running around flood DRR program, and they also experience that children, they are always very enthusiastic. They will grasp easily, they are more receptive. And secondly, children, once they go back home, they always take the learnings to their parents also. So at least some amount of awareness, some amount of sensitization goes back to the families also. So this is a very beautiful example carried out by the state. Yes, you have similar, very many examples in other parts of the country also, but this is very specific to flood as a concern. This is an example from central India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, where one of the rivulets had died, and there were a lot of habitation around that rivulet. And the local people realized the importance of rejuvenating that rivulet, that small river, because it was causing a lot. It was basically an agrarian community around, and people were severely getting impacted. One, because of lack of that water for irrigation facility, and also their groundwater was also depleting. So a lot of those zones was now minus that groundwater facility. So with the help of awareness generation, with the involvement of local community and especially young volunteers from schools and colleges, the district administration, they, within a span of 1 month's time, with the utilization of some of the local schemes, because I'm sure in other countries also you have a lot of human development related projects and schemes are taking place, right? So with the utilization of funds which are available in some of these local schemes, they see, look here in this picture, they revived the entire rivulet, and now this water is being utilized for irrigation also and for other facilities also. This is again an example from the Brahmaputra basin, again from Assam, state of Assam, which perpetually sees flooding, intense floodings every year. So this is Brahmaputra river. This house is just adjacent here. And this is how the people at the local level, they cope. So they start raising the bed, the levels of the bedding, and this lady informed me that up to this level the flood water reaches. And this is what I was referring to. If you look at this picture with the small child, once the flood water recedes back, your drinking water supply gets immensely impacted. For a country like India, a lot of our hand pumps, for taking the groundwater, these are generally constructed at the ground levels. You have similar ample examples for other states, and that's why post flooding epidemics becomes another major concern. It becomes a major headache, along with issues, other health issues like malaria, dengue, fever, and diarrhea, because waterborne diseases go on a rise. So we encourage the local administrations to raise the bars of these hand pumps. I would show that example from another state, but just to wind up this example, with the help of some of the local projects that were running in the state of Assam, near to this Brahmaputra river, this 14-kilometer long embankment is being created so that people from this vicinity can actually take shelter there and not lose their lives and livestock, otherwise which they were losing because of floodings. And this is again one of the the farmland of this family itself. It is a very small zone where they grow multiple crops. So they have about 8 to 10 different fruits and vegetables that they grow in the small zone. So they say that some of these crops and vegetables, or these fruits and vegetables, are drought proof. Some of them withstand little flood waters. So at any given point of time, they sustain. So they have something or the other as a facility. Even this, which you see, this green creep that you see, this is actually a vegetable plant. So you grow vegetables here. So, my point here is that you should encourage communities to go for multiple croppings. So they will withstand droughts, and they would also withstand floods. This is an example from again the state of Uttar Pradesh. This is river Gomati, which sees a lot of breaching. So a lot of breaching happens in Gomati when you have rainy season. This entire farmlands around, they completely convert into flood areas. And this water reaches the houses. So these are the houses where the water reaches. And again, what I was trying to show. See, your hand pumps, this is so much of dirt around. So once the water recedes back, a lot of waste, solid waste from the river, it comes back to the houses. So A, you are promoting raised platforms for houses here. And B, we encourage the district administration to have raised hand pumps, so that the hand pumps are constructed at a height where at least the flood water does not reach, and at least people for long durations will have better drinking water facilities, and they are not in a dearth of that drinking water facility supply. Likewise, this is an example from the coastal state of West Bengal, where you have mangrove Sundarbans. A lot of people may be aware of Sundarbans, which are beautiful forest, mangrove forest. They protect you from cyclones, from heavy wind speeds, and a lot of mangrove regeneration is being taken up as a mitigation practice so that it saves them from flooding. The communities that live on the other side, it saves them from flooding, and also it saves them from cyclonic activities. This is another example where from Majuli Island, from the state of Assam, which is perpetually, this island is flooded. The island is shrinking in its size, and people earlier here used to practice farming. They gave up farming, they started migrating. There was a lot of poverty issues, and now they have come up with this beautiful experiment which is called hydroponic trays. Now they grow medicinal plants and vegetables in trays, in water trays, and look at the amount of money they fetch. They make really a good harvest, and these are local examples which can be tried and tested in other places also. So I'll stop here. I think already exceeded the time, but these are some of the examples I wanted to quote and just provide you with some food for thought, some ideas of how these local examples, along with the inclusion of socially vulnerable groups and some of the sustainable development agendas, should be taken up by all of you in your respective sectors. That will be all from my side. I hope this was of some use. Thank you.
There is one question in the chat
Yes.
box.
Okay.
That how does COVID apply to flood risk management?
Oh, okay. So, see, COVID requires certain very specific protocols to be followed, right? Now, you are talking about social distancing, you are talking about health hygiene, but there are places which are very thickly habitated where people will have to, during flood times, they have to vacate their houses. Like I was showing the last examples, when the flood water will recede, you will have concerns of waterborne diseases, waterborne issues. So you will have more epidemic issues happening. You are already dealing with pandemic, then you will have to also deal with other epidemic concerns like diarrhea, dengue, chikungunya, malaria, drinking shortage of drinking water supply. You will not have adequate enough fresh water, safe water for washing hands and all these facilities. So that makes water as a resource challenging, and that makes, like I was mentioning, in your approaches, you should have a multi-hazard approach. So think how you can also deal with pandemic situation, save people with better facilities of health hygiene, distancing, and also manage a flood situation. That's the idea I wanted to give. The Majuli example, hydroponics. You can read about the hydroponic trays. It's what you do is you have these specific trays which are constructed, and they are kept on those water in the water zones itself, in the water only, and you have certain very specific nutrients that you put, and these medicinal plants and vegetables don't require soil, or they don't require that kind of nutrients, right, which you otherwise need from the soil. And that is the reason they are able to grow these medicinal crops which otherwise have a very good market value. So hydroponic trays is an example which is picking up very much. There's another very beautiful example of sack gardening. I'm sorry, I missed out on that example. The sack gardening example from Bangladesh. So how they are trying to prevent flooding is they grow a lot of vegetables in sacks. So they have those sacks which are filled with soil and a desired amount of nutrient, and you can place those sacks above floodwater levels. So as a particular country or as a zone that when our place floods, the water reaches a particular level. So you can place those sacks above those levels, right? So, and that has a lot of soil and give it that agility, and then you grow a lot of vegetables and crops in them. That example is really picking up. Sack gardening, you can Google sack gardening. I'll just mention it here. This is an example from Bangladesh. You can really learn from it. You can look at the National Disaster Management Plan of India from this website. I've just posted it. You can download. For India, we have made a national plan for disaster management, so that can also
lost you.
Are you there?
Can we move forward?
Leave? Okay.
Sushma ma'am, we were
Yeah.
we were not able to hear you for like 2 minutes last.
Yeah, I'm having some network issues, so I just lost track, so I don't know. You do not have any, see, you have specific SOPs for dam management, but then each dam has its own, specifications and demarcations. So they are with respect to that particular dams. You can access some of these guidelines again from the NDMA websites in terms of the location where these dams can be constructed and what kind of, depending upon whether it's a flood area or it's an earthquake area. And then you have those specifications mentioned. It's more of an engineering aspect. So based on the location, the terrain, the kind of requirements, these specifications vary. You do not have a very generalized SOP for dam management. Not a generalized, because see, Kerala is experiencing flooding. Kerala is a coastal state, and at the same time, if you experience flooding in a north hilly state, it will be two different terrains, right? So the entire engineering changes. So that's how it differs.
Ma'am, this one question is very interesting. I
Okay.
think this will this one question is,
Hmm.
are there any issue variables that researcher miss out to cover but are very important that is necessary to address?
I'm not able to understand. Nitish, can you repeat it?
Okay, so the question is like in a research, is there any variable or
Yeah.
very important
Okay. Yeah.
issues
Okay. Okay.
which
Chat.
which
Oh,
usually
interesting.
researcher missed out, but it's very
Yeah.
important.
So, we need to maybe, look at more, like I was talking about the mixed cropping, right? Now, a lot of research needs to go into salt tolerant growing of hybrid crops, vegetables. There's very less of all of that. In terms of like how these hydroponic trays are grown, you can look at similar research opportunities for what kind of other vegetations can be grown for different regions. This is something which is a very localized example from one place in India. We have very less of research centered around these things. There's a lot of research on the kind of areas, the kind of locations, and where you need to have constructions or what kind of mitigation, soft and hard measures need to be put in place. But there's less of research in terms of centered around these sectors, especially agriculture, variable kind of. This is one part. There must be many more other things also that you can focus upon. How social dynamism changes, how for some communities they are able to maybe adapt to a particular flooding situation, and why even with a lesser intensity floods some other communities not able to even cope up. So what makes a community, so that social dynamism aspect, in terms of the impact assessment studies, social impact assessment studies, they're very less on that aspect also research. There's less research on the kind of vulnerability indexes and vulnerability parameters that need to be integrated in the subject of disaster management. We only look at only 1, 2, 3, 4 aspects. We look at biodiversity, we look at eco zones, or we look at the social fabric. But there's more to it. So that these are also areas where researchers can focus more on, vulnerability indexes, capacity indexes, how they impact or they make changes in the social fabrics or dynamism. Yes, there are ample of indigenous practices around globe. Like I was quoting, even this hydroponics is a very localized example. You can look at some very beautiful examples of how Thailand as a country grows crops on water. So they have they have their agriculture growing on water. So now that's a very localized way. They have the localized solutions of how they do that. In terms of India, I had quoted 2-3 examples of how we are looking at raising the flood pumps, and that's more from the management perspective, right? In terms of early warning system, there's been immense progress in India for people to have early warnings, to have those alert systems. There are ample actually examples of localized indigenous examples. Now, why this question, the issue that this question is raised here is there is less of documentation of such local examples. That is also something I harp upon. We do not document a lot of small case studies, localized case studies, and disseminate it. If you have more of that, this is how information will flow, and that is what is lacking. So we need, even if you have some very good small local example, you can always document it and disseminate it. There's so much of social media where you can utilize those platforms to spread those information. That is lacking, and that is why we keep looking for such examples. Is that all?
I think now, like, there are lots of questions, but we need to, like, Nivedha is waiting also.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can I leave then?
Yes, ma'am. Thank
Fine.
you.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Over to you, Muskan. Thank you, ma'am.
If you want any specific communication for your research topic, please you can write to me. I'll definitely try and give you some suggestions. I'm sharing my email address here. Feel free to write to me. I'll try and revert back with whatever understanding I have. All right. All the best. Bye, everyone.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Now, I would like to invite Ms. Nivedha Elango. She have pursued postgraduate degree in Integrated Water Resource Management at Anna University. During her master's, she had obtained South Asian Water Fellowship from IDRC Canada, where she had to work on the climate change impact in a disaster-prone region. She have undergone an internship with Global Water Partnership stakeholder Stockholm, mainly focused on SDC 6.5.1, indicator implementation, and valuing water initiatives. Currently, a research student working on ecosystem-based solution for disaster risk reduction, along with East Coast of India. The proposed research is based on the valuation of ecosystem service in relation to the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development. Over to you to discuss more about the role of youth in community-based risk management.
Thank you, Muskan. Do you hear me clear and loud?
Yes, ma'am, it's clearly.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to have me here to talk on role of youth in community-based flood risk management. As you have all seen in the previous presentation, Sushma ma'am had given a wonderful and beautiful explanations and different case studies on what is really a community-based flood risk management with involvement of women and children, mainly on the food security and water security perspective. So I'm going to just highlight what is community-based management in the first session, and followed by what youth are really capable and how youth can be involved in flood risk management. So moving on to the presentation. So, what is a community? So, we all know there is we are focusing on community-based management. We really want community to get involved. So, what is a community? Community is a group of people living in the same place. It has to be either topographically a same people, those who live in the same region, or having a particular characteristic in common. So, from a territorial point of view, a community corresponds to the people living in the region. From a societal point of view, community is more than the territorial boundary, more than the geographical boundary, where different communities from different territorial region may dwell together because they have the same cultural perspectives, but also people living in the same territorial region may not get along and may have different perspectives and That is because the cultural differences among them. So the first most important thing in understanding the community based management is to identify the community that which we are targeting to. So we can have different measures, we can have different interventions, community interventions, but we have to be very clear on what community are we going to choose, when especially with the flood risk management. So, community participation is definitely not a new principle which has come recently, but it's almost for more than 30 years. Basically, when everything was going on correct, something was missing, which is the bottom up approach. Because top down approach is definitely not going to solve every situation, and it doesn't have solution for all the development activities and policies. So that is where, when we had the integrated water resources management, which I'm a graduate of, which I'm always very proud of it, because the main principle is the bottom up approach. So we have to talk to the people and bring the ideas out of the people before we generally decide for any particular location. So it is also an important step, because we definitely do not have to see community as the passive receivers, or those who are in the community and we are protecting them from flood. It is definitely not that way. They are supposed to be recognized as an active actors. They are who is going to protect themselves from flood, and also giving solutions for the policymakers and the implementers. And they are going this has to be a mutual mutual communication between the implementers and the policy makers, the decision makers, and the people who are actually involved in a particular region, or who is vulnerable to the particular flood or any other disaster. So when we talk about flood, each year there is almost 50 to 300 floods worldwide, and impacting an estimated of 520 million people, which is definitely not a small number, and also causing 25,000 deaths. This is just a number, but 25,000 is like leaving 25,000 families impacted, and the impact is large. So there is two ways to protect lives and properties. So there are, as you might all know, there are two measures, that is structural and non-structural. So structural measure is keeping flood water away from people. So it's like we are building a structural intervention so that the flood water isn't going to affect, or it isn't going to at may, have an impact on the people. The second measure is the non-structural, that is we are protecting ourselves from the flood water. So this is the major difference between the structural and non-structural. So where do community get involved? Because people can majorly play a role in non-structural interventions, because non-structural measures are such as awareness generation, knowledge dissemination, early warning information dissemination, organizing people, warning and evacuation. So these are the non-structural measures which people are involved. It also reduces the cost of structural measures. For an example, a flood wall is constructed to protect from floods, riverine or coastal floods. If the flood is maybe the flood is even more severe than estimated, or even more impactful, because nature has its own way, and the prediction and the accuracy of prediction cannot always be 100%. So there is going to be a damage to the structural measure, and again we are going to recreate it, and this involves a lot of cost at the planning level itself. So so these are the non-structural measures. So these non-structural measures involving the community are definitely going to reduce the cost of the structural measures, and also make the people and the community with more flood defense, and contributing to the design and maintenance. So we have to see that, as I mentioned earlier, people and communities are no longer seen as recipients. They have to be seen as a part of the stakeholders, and they are the critical stakeholders who have to play a major role. So it is more effective. Uh, just because we involve community, we have a multi-stakeholder consultation, we have discussions, we involve community, is definitely not going to be effective, because community are not that much engaged or that much aware as a decision maker or a policy maker or a researcher who works on the flood data or the rainfall data. They are definitely not much well informed or full conscious. So what we have to do is we have to involve community as well as when they are empowered and trained. So it is also a duty of them planners and the decision makers to empower and train the community before they are involved in any of the consultations, which is definitely going to increase the effectiveness of the flood risk assessment. So it is important that people are provided with an opportunity to play a more active role, interact with the government, public officials, and provide a support for the they have to act as a catalyst, and they are active support of for the community-based flood risk management program. So if you see the picture, so this is from a Volta Basin project. So this is the courtesy from WMO, World Meteorological Organization, where they are involved in Volta Basin project. This woman is a meat seller, and she has been used as the source person to disseminate information on early warning system. Why is she chosen? Because she sells meat door to door, and she is a part of the community who really trust her, and she also has a very good public relation with the local community, and she is responsible to deliver the door to door early warning system, because she knows who are the people, and she knows the easiest access route to their houses, and she has this has been implemented, and she has communicated several warning messages reaching every section of the community, which was challenging before, because it is absolutely necessary to identify one or a group of person who knows the direct access to each and every one of the community, because when it is a flood risk assessment or management, the basic principle is no life is gone. Everybody has to be protected and everybody has to be saved. So this is one of the best example for a community based she contributes on early warning system information dissemination. So, what is a community-based flood management? So this is a step-by-step, which I'll be explaining you. So we have 6 steps, and the first one is designing the process. The importance to have 6 different steps is usually the community or the people are they're not most involved in before there is a flood. They are not involved in a plan, in drafting an action plan, or having the planning earlier. What is the flood risk management plan, because they are least involved. They are mostly involved in the implementation stage. They are involved in they know, they are given information and they do it, but I assume that that is not the correct way to involve community. They have to be from the start of the process till the end. So that is where they are going to be aware, and they are going to be equipped, and they improve their capacity in flood management. So moving on to the step 1, this is the design of the process. So if we are going to draft a flood management plan and for a particular region, we definitely need to have important stakeholders such as the government officials, the researchers who are actually working on there, the implementers, the local NGOs, and also the most important are the community stakeholders. So they all have a shared vision through a participatory process. As Sushma ma'am mentioned, participatory process is definitely needed in terms of community-based management. So we all have participatory discussion, and this has to be the representatives role is to inform this, whatever the plan, whatever the process is going to be happen, that is going to be take place, that has to go to the community. So it's like raising awareness campaign, in talking to the community and identifying information. So this is a two-way process. We design the process and we let know the community, okay, this is going to be the process we are going to adapt. Definitely we are going to get inputs from the community based on their local knowledge and the traditional knowledge, because usually when we go to a field study, we definitely try to identify a older person over there, because he knows what happened earlier and how was the flood impact. He can even sometimes it's very useful, because they sometimes even show the flood marks. This is the level of water, this was the level of water. So it is definitely important to consider their information as well. And second step is to access the vulnerability and risk. Now, as I said, the first process is using historical and local knowledge of the community, and then take an inventory studies, that is such as land use practices, resource location, natural course of river. These are all some inventory studies that has to be done, and use a multi-hazard perspective, because any intervention that has to be multi-hazard, and we have to understand what are the maximum hazards and what are all the possible hazards for that particular region, and then assess a flood vulnerability. And align the identified risk with the risk perceived by stakeholders. Because as a researcher, as a policy maker, we might find that this region is going to have this many risk and this many impacts, but it is also most important to learn from the people over there, because they might have different perception, they might have witnessed earlier different risks. So it is definitely, we have to align our risk with this perceived by the stakeholders and identify risk at communities and support community level risk assessment. So moving on to the third step, now we have the process and we have assessed the vulnerability and the risk, and now we are narrowing down to the problem analysis. So we have what are the problems involved. So we have to assess the capacities of the community members and the institutions. So are they well equipped, and what do we really need for a better flood management, and assess the capacities, and then identify positive and negative human factors contributing to the flooding, and then identify flood prone areas in terms of risk level according to different flood magnitudes. So these are, if you see the each and individual step, it involves both scientific technical intervention and also a local knowledge and a historical knowledge intervention. There are two different perspectives, which is definitely possible only when we have a community engagement in flood management. And moving on to the step 4 is, now we know the problem, so we know what people are capable of what, and what institution is capable of doing which, and now we know the each and every individual stakeholders positive, negative, and who knows what, and we have a sort of information. Now, this is our time to set the goals. So, determine the objectives based on flood risk assessment, results, and vision, and decide on the scope of the community activities, and take a note of regional development objectives. Like, say, so this flood risk management is definitely not going to solve the issue of only the flood. Preventing people from floods, but it is also going to address other sustainable development goals, because as Sushma ma'am said, this is connected to food security, this is connected to water security, this is connected to the human well-being. And also, if you do a nature-based solution, if you have restoring mangroves in your flood risk management plan, it is definitely going to have an impact on preserving the ecosystem and developing and having our environment and saving our environment. So the most important aspect is, when you have a good flood management plan, it is going to impact on several other uh, dimensions of SDG as well. And next step is to develop an action plan. So this is an action plan which is going to be followed throughout the flood management progress. So we have to evaluate possible measures within the scope and develop an action plan with clear roles, activities, and responsibilities, and set the timelines and expected results. Carry out an economic analysis, which is also very important, and set procedures for monitoring, and then share the draft with the community. So recently, it has been very useful, and it has been very effective when the action plan is actually shared with the community, because they look at the action plan, they look at what is going to happen to their region, and they evaluate the action plans. And now the last step is implementation in stages, because we have 4 stages in flood management, which is prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. So preventions is, what are the prevention measures, which both structural and non-structural, which could be done uh, in order to prevent us from flood. And preparedness is when there is a flood risk, what are the as the previous presentation, to have enough food and enough kit, a flood proof kit. So these are all the preparedness stage. And then response, after an event, there is definitely going to be a response strategy. And recovery, so we have this flood and we have faced the impacts, and how are we going to recover. So as I also wanted to mention, that flood is more in along the coast regions, it is very important to also address the wash sanitation aspect, and also the waterborne diseases aspect. So these are all the implement stages, and this is how a flood management plan with involvement of community has to be done. So moving on. So as I said, a real participation of community is, of course, there is definitely going to be there are some barriers. If we have good community and if we have good participation, it is very easy. It seems like very easy that we go talk to community, they talk to us, and we engage, we prepare an action plan, and we are ready, and we have a really good flood management plan. But in reality, it is definitely not possible to have a 100% positive situation. There is definitely a barrier for community to participate, and the most important barrier is social and economic features, especially poverty, education, access to social services, livelihood profile, cultural beliefs, status of weaker social groups. Because when there is when one individual is even facing a situation from poverty, he is definitely not going to besides having his own Muskan, am I audible? Because
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Uh, yes, Niveda,
yeah,
just one
because I
request, please
yeah,
go a little slower.
yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we really know what are the barriers that we are going to face when involving a community. So considering the social and economic features, when as I was saying, when an individual has his own problems, has if he is in poverty and he doesn't even have a 3-day meal, he is definitely not going to be interested to participate in a stakeholder consultation. If you say that you can be protected from flood, it is not the only problem that he is actually having. He already has different problems to him, so we have to take that into consideration as well. We have to group the people, we have to understand, okay, what people are what type. We have to understand the social problems as well. So now we have as similar to poverty, we also have few people who lack education, lack awareness, who have different cultural beliefs, and they also have different status of work. So these are all different social and economic features. The most important is there is always a minority group in every community and every region in almost every country who are always excluded from the regular community events as well. Other than flood risk management, they are usually excluded. But if you see, they are most vulnerable because they usually lie below the flood, they nearby the river banks, or they are in the lower floodplain who are directly going to be affected. So as a planner, as a decision maker, when you are going to involve community, it is in your hand, and you have to engage them such that you are not leaving anyone behind, and not leaving any information that is definitely going to improve your flood risk management plan. So as I mentioned, these are the following social economic factors as described. So it's poverty, marginal areas, gender issues are currently being addressed in several countries, but still there is a lack of involvement of women, because as we all know, um, women are already in a vulnerable situation, but when there is a flood, women are put in even more vulnerable situation, because they have direct contact with uh, they are more prone to diseases, waterborne diseases, because they have to protect their children, and they have to give 3-day meal. So it's different for women, it's a different from women perspective. So we have to make sure we include women in our community based engagement, we involve them, and we have a fruitful and effective flood management plan. So as I say, it is all very easy to speak out and have it as in policies, but it's really difficult when you have to implement in field, which is definitely not a 1-day process, but it has to change slowly. So these are all some of the barriers which you have to keep in mind when you are going to plan a community based flood management. So, to have an exam in Nepal, there is a community-based flood forecasting system. Usually, it is in 3 color codes to define different alert levels. Same that as of hospitals. That is red for severe, orange, yellow for minor, and green. That is there is no flood warning. So this kind of initiatives actually get the people involved, and if you have a signboard and if you have a color code, which is actually going to make the community, it is going to make it easy for the community people to understand, and they are also going to cooperate accordingly. So this is one sort of example that is followed in Nepal, which is actually a very good system. And in this system, people play a major role because they usually send the river level and send water level information to the concerned district and national agencies during rainy season. So they are on the field, they are near the river bank, so they measure, they see the levels, and there is a color code, say they see the color codes and they send the information, and this system is greatly helping and issuing warnings to affected population, so through the district disaster management committees. So it is definitely mandatory to have the direct communication to the community at the local level. So one organization has a direct contact and they can pass on the information to the national level. And community participation can represent a way to bridge cooperation between individuals and external agencies of flood management, especially at the recovery stage. So nobody can understand the local situation and needs better than the local community themselves. So it's not like if you involve them at the planning level, they are definitely going to be very helpful at the recovery stage. So it is not like you depend on the community only for response and recovery, but they are part of this flood risk management. They are involved from the starting phase, stage 1, and they are being involved in every process. So they'll definitely have the most important part in any of the community management is to gain the trust of community. So they have to trust you and they have to send out the information to you, and you also have to be very careful when you are handling with the communities. So all these process, all these steps leads to the that leads to the most important term, that is community resilience. So as United States Agency for International Development states that resilience is the ability of people, households, communities, countries and systems to migrate, adapt and recover from shocks and stresses. So if we follow all these individual steps, we are definitely making the community resilient, and they are going to have a different they are going to have reduced impact to the flood, and they are going to have different perspectives to assess a flood risk management. So moving on to my second agenda of this presentation, that is youth. So as the topic, as of my topic, why are youth important and what can youth do in flood risk management? Now it has been so many years that we have started to voice out for youth, and we are starting to involve them in different events. Why in flood risk management? As the most important thing which I consider is they are the best persons to share the message. So youth can help sharing the message, they can act as the focal points for the community. They can do it, they are actually very quick in doing that, and they are very creative in doing that, and they act as the change makers. So they are uh, as Sushma ma'am earlier said, children usually get the information from school and share it with the parents. At the similar way, we can train the youth in a community. So when they are trained, they know about their community and they get the information from the organizations and institutions. They pass it on to the community and helping them to prepare for disasters. And the third most important point is young minds are always creative. They bring more creative and resourceful ideas, and they seek for different, very smart solutions and different solutions rather than the traditional pattern that we follow during a flood risk management. So by involving youth in disaster preparedness and recovery efforts, they can, it's not only increase the youth's awareness on particular assets, but also enhances the chance that they openly discuss. So they protect their loved ones, they protect their family. So when you give youth such kind of leadership quality, it is definitely going to grow them as an individual as well. And youth can play a range of roles in youth preparedness programs and play a crucial role in recovery efforts. As we all see, whenever there is a flood and whenever there is a impact, any disaster, youth are in the forefront for recovery and relief measures. But meaningful youth engagement is not only on relief and recovery measures, but they have to be involved in planning as well. So the threat of disasters and impact of changing climate are, apart from youth being a critical person, a resource person, they are also vulnerable to such events. When there is an event, they have going to carry their they are going to they are witnessing the impacts, they are witnessing, and they are going to carry it to their rest of their lives. So treating them as a positive victims or a homogeneous group misses. So if we have to give them special attention when we treat them as a part of the community. So this kind of youth are, they have a long way to go, and this any event should definitely do not uh, create a negative atmosphere for them. Rather than, if they are involved in this flood preparedness program, they are going to grow in a positive way, and they are going to take their leadership role. And in many corners of the world, both developing, young people are a force of change, asserting themselves as agent with full powerful voice on public scene. So as I earlier mentioned, local youth are already always seen in responding to a disasters by rescuing people, distributing relief. This has to be increased, and they have to be in the planning stage, which definitely grows, which definitely gives an opportunity for them to grow as an individual from a young person to a beautiful leader who's going to go into the future world. So that this is how youth has to be involved, and there are several examples, and I'm going to share one such example from Nepal. So there was a competition from Global Water Partnership and WMO on behalf of APFM in 2017, and this was the winning uh, idea from Nepal, how youth are involved. So this is a simple case study. Background of this particular region in Nepal is that they continuously face flood, and they are affected with lots of impacts, and every people are definitely every individual has their own impacts. So it is they found this group of youth, they found out that it is definitely a major thing uh, to reduce this knowledge gap, that as I was early mentioning, they wanted to train the community, they wanted to equip them, and they wanted to build their capacity. So what did they actually do is, they increase the flood access knowledge of the community. So young social mobilizers and volunteers, what they this is a particular group, and they train young volunteers and mobilizers from the community to be a part of participatory mapping process with digital maps and open street maps and other spatial information. So to be very clear, what these young people do is, they have information, they already have information from the government website, they know what is the rainfall over particular years, they know the flood information. We also now have the satellite images. So this is, they have all the informations collected, but they wanted this to be taken to the community. The community also should understand, if there is this much of rainfall, what are the regions are going to be affected, how the flood is going to enter, or what lands are going to be inundated. So they wanted this information and this knowledge to be penetrated to the community. So what they do is, these young group of volunteers, they work on both technical and also on the social side. They prepare maps, they work on satellite images. At the same time, they go to the community, they ask the community to draw a map. So where they draw a particular region on a big chart or on the ground, they draw it, and they ask the community to identify how this is going to what do you think of the flooding pattern of the what happens in the earlier stages, what happens, how the flooding is going to take place, how the water is going to run through. So this is what they wanted to know. They wanted the people to understand, okay, whenever there is a rainfall, the flood for the water first hits here, it is going to run from here to there and there to there, and these houses are going to get inundated, and this is going to happen. So they wanted every single person of their community to be well educated. So this is one of the greatest strength which I consider youth are capable of. They are technologically strong. Not they want to learn new things, create new things, and I definitely consider youth are one of the powerful resource to penetrate these knowledge to the community people. So this project was awarded, and now we see that they are continuously doing several activities, and now everybody in the community is capable of understanding what is happening in and around, what is map. Even we have the responses of some of the social mobilizer. So what they say is, we can now map all the shelter locations and resources. So it's very nice to see a young person from the community saying that they can locate the shelter locations, and that is very much important in a flood risk management session. And another person states that before we just bring in the data, but now we bring it and share it to the whole world. Having the satellite data, having the local data, they send it to they now share it with everybody. And the third person also states that he is capable of training other people now. So with paper maps, we used to struggle a lot with big size of charts. Now they have everything online. So this is how youth can change the community, and young volunteers are now capable of doing of having a flood proof region. So this is one of the interesting case studies from Nepal, which I thought I could share with you all. And so I have identified few themes and what can youth do with a particular theme. So we have disaster risk mitigation. Now, what actions can youth actually do? Youth are to encourage the community in constructing flood-proof houses, organizing the preparedness kits at household levels, and creating awareness on safe wash practices. So wash is nothing but water, sanitation, and hygiene, where as I mentioned earlier, we are definitely having to face a severe waterborne disease post flood. So youth can play a major role in creating awareness. So whoever who is attending this session, just take a time to look around your community, what is actually happening when there is a flood. Just these are all small actions. If this is just involves talking and being engaged to your community, just go and ask them a question, what you really want when there is a disaster or when there is a flood. They might have lots to say to you, but it is all left unheard and unrecorded, and that is the major problem here. So youth can also spread awareness on disaster insurance schemes. Every country definitely has some safety nets or insurance schemes which they are definitely not being informed. The community, especially the women headed households, they are definitely not informed. Youth can actually act as a uh, point between the women and actually the insurance agencies or the government organizations. And we already talked a lot about the community-based disaster risk management. We can do risk mapping, as I showed earlier in the Nepal case. And disaster and environment. Whenever there is a disaster, there are lots of studies to highlight the loss of lives and loss of properties. But every disaster has 50% of improving the environment, and 50% the environment is getting degraded. So youth of a community can promote the greening activities such as tree plantation in the open spaces, conserve the surface water bodies, and effective and sustainable solid waste disposal, promote ecosystem based disaster reduction, such as Susma mentioned, there are several floating agriculture, flood tolerant seeds. There are several other localized case studies which youth are now technically equipped. They can definitely search something through Google or go, which is definitely they are going to look at get the information from throughout the world. They can pick up a particular case which suits their region, and they can help the community. And intersector coordination, youth, especially youth from Red Cross, they can act as a potential link between the local government and the community. And capacity building, as I mentioned earlier, we have to have community capacity develop programs, especially for youth, so that they work uh, diligently for flood risk management. And people centered early warning system, as we mentioned, there is in Nepal there is a red, a green and orange system where people, that actually is a very creative tool. And we can also have other early warning system tools and youth friendly online platforms. And youth are to be trained on early warning system, because if they have access to the meteorological and climate data, youth can do wonders in information dissemination. So this is just a link. If anybody is from the organization, you can just think of having one community representative. They are definitely going to be more useful to you. And youth definitely we have so much that youth can do to us, and we definitely have to support them. So we can have a network, we can create them, we can create a team of network within them, so they can talk to themselves, they can they and also recognize the youth activities, and we can give training on life skills, other, and the most important is adult youth mentorship. So this has to be increased, because we definitely do not we cannot lose the adult experience, because they have experience, they have very well they are very well resourced, they have lots of information. The main the gap that is lying is the adult youth mentorship. So it has to be a mentorship between adult and youth, which is definitely going to increase the capability of the young people. And this is the map for the meaningful youth engagement. We, as I said, we all have youth involved, but it's really meaningful. So we have youth in research and evaluation. So we have to have youth in research, we have to youth in advocacy, decision making, which is very much lacking, because we do not definitely consider youth to have a decision, or making decisions on policies, which has to be there, and which is definite. We have to gain the trust in youth, and they are definitely going to create wonders and help us. So for all in this, if you are a young person and if you are below 35, this is a wonderful opportunity for you. There is a youth competition that is coming up, which will be officially launched by end of October or the first week of November. So this is a global integrated flood and drought management competition, and you can see more information in the link which I'll put in the chat box after the presentation. So this is to showcase how people-centered early warning approaches can be advanced by or through the involvement of youth. So if you are a young person working on early warning system, and if you really want your idea to be recognized, and if you really need support, you can definitely join this competition, and I'll put the link and you can go in for further information. And I'm also happy to announce that this is the platform for young youth and young professional platform for South Asia. So if you are uh, youth from South Asia, I strongly encourage you to join this network. I'll definitely post this. We have a Facebook and a Instagram page where you can follow us and join our network. And if you want your work to be recognized at the global level, we are here to do it for you. And others from other region or can also join us and be a strong support to us, because it's all about regions, but you can be with us and be a strong support, and we can take inputs from you. And this is how the network is definitely going to grow. So this network is just started, so if you really want to be a part of it, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And um, so yeah, that's it from my side, and thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the insightful session and letting us know about the role of youth in community based flood risk management and to cope up with disaster risk and reducing their vulnerability. Now, we will have our question answer round. Whoever wants to ask any question to our speaker, they can directly write in the chat box, or you can raise your hand so that I can unmute you. Anyone who want to ask any question, you can write in the chat box. Ma'am, there is one question that what could be done in situation where there is heavy flooding and no health facility?
Health facility, I don't understand what they mean on health facility, but there are even situations where there is a flooding and people lack basic facilities, such as even for a wash sanitation purpose, or there is a breakout of disease, and even people cannot afford that. These are all situation that needs to be highlighted at the planning level. There is no possibility once there is flood, there is a breakout, there is a disaster, and there is a waterborne disease breakout, and we definitely cannot address at that point. So this information has to be taken to the local government, even at the planning level, for which I consider young people of that community can definitely take up this idea, say that there is no flood, there is no health facility in my region, and community has to speak up for their particular needs and bring in light to the government. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Michael Deng from South Sudan. I have a quick question in regard to the roles of the youth in the community during emergencies. In case youth are willing to respond based on the needs, and there are limited resources, maybe its resources are not enough that can be used during a response. What can be done in that situation? Make sure that you are prepared to respond accordingly.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's a very good question, because there are lots of young people over here throughout the globe who definitely want to contribute, but they lack resources, and they lack they cannot do it because they are not they are not well equipped and well informed on what is happening in and around. So this is definitely a action that has to be taken, and that is the responsibility of the government and the local organization. If they have to give them adequate training before the uh, flood event or even during an emergency, and you young people, if there is if they are if there is one person, he can definitely talk to others, they can form a network, and they can have they can equip themselves also. And there are several examples for such emergency situation where young people together, they form a network, and they take their step to the local government over there, they talk to them, they prove their ideas. And this all has to be done earlier at the time of response. If he is lacking resources, the basic help he could do is look around what is happening and just help at least a few of the families that is nearby. That he can even though he is not financially capable, or he doesn't have any other resources, what he can do is he can act as a he can act as a point where he can pass on the information from the community to the government. So that could actually be one of the way where youth can be involved. That is where, which is very much lacking, because the information, it stays with the community, it doesn't go to the government, or from the government it stays with there and it doesn't come to the community. So that is where youth can act as a pass between them. So that is one way where youth can be involved when he is definitely lacking of resources. But what I would clearly suggest is to have a network within themselves if they are really interested to work on such emergencies.
Thank you very much. Point is noted.
Any other question?
There is one question: what is the remedy for food security? As Sushma ma'am earlier mentioned, there are different activities that is actually going on, and she showed a wonderful example of a granary where they store all the rice before the flood itself. So it is definitely not at the food security. If we have to have that, it is definitely well planned ahead, and that is not possible by any individual. It has to be done as a community event. There is one more question. Transboundary cooperation becomes imperative in many cases of flood management. How can adversarial states like Pakistan and India ensure? Youth nowadays, if you see, there is a global network, there is inter-regional network. As I mentioned, we are also proposing a South Asia Water Youth Network, where youth are they have to come out of their region, and they definitely have to talk to other they have to talk to the agencies or youth organizations in the near, if you say India and Pakistan, the two countries, and they can do wonders, because as a network in the South Asia Younger Youth Water Professional Platform, we are not only from India, we also work with young professionals from the Pakistan, from Bhutan, and from Nepal, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So we all work together. So it is definitely possible. When we work together, we get to know their ideas, we get to know their issues, we get to know their problems. We might propose solutions and they might propose solutions to us. So transboundary cooperation is possible when you have young people from different countries working together. I do not find any other question, Muskan.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's move forward. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Nitish Barole for the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Before we end the session, there are some announcements. The first, obviously, about sharing the presentations and sharing you the recordings. So please don't worry. Give us 1 or 2 days. We are already collecting the presentations, and the recording will be uploaded on the YouTube. So we will share all the details with like presentations and the recordings to all of you by mail. We already have your email addresses and everything with us. So you don't worry about putting your email address in the chat box or any other personal details. You will get it. Don't worry about it. The second about the certificate. So I'm going to share you the feedback link in the chat box, as well as by tonight I'm also sending you by mail this feedback link. And so what you can do is you have to fill this feedback form by end of this week, and then give us at least 7 days to to prepare your certificates and send it to you. So please have a patience. And if you have submitted the feedback form, you are surely going to get the certificate in like in next 7 and 10 days. So please don't worry about it, and you will get it. Don't worry. And of course, now we have come to the end of this as this 3 days training program. We are grateful to have you all here today for this program. I express my gratitude to all the speakers and young professionals for sharing their rich and practical experience with us all. I thank all the participants for their active involvement during the program. I would also like to thank all the organizers and supporters of the event for their proactive support for the success of this event, mainly WWF USA, Women for Water Partnership, Sri Lanka Water Partnership, Netwater, Tours, and Ross India. Once again, I thank you all. Thank you.
To all.
Thank you, Niveda.